I'm Michael Diamond Hunter, and I am an LSE fellow here at the Department of Philosophy, Logic, and Scientific Method. Today I'm going to be giving a talk on the limits of accuracy for retrospective description of racial groups. And so we're going to start with an outline for what's going to transpire today. I'm going to try to provide some motivation for the investigation. I'm going to talk a little bit about an overview of the debates on historical description, both in philosophy and in history. I'm going to sketch out and start to develop a solution for the problem. I'm going to describe some further implications and upshots of my particular account, and then I'm going to provide a conclusion for today's talk. So, with respect to motivating the investigation, groups and individuals, at least as far as human beings are concerned, are deeply connected for all sorts of reasons, whether or not it connects to things like identity, feelings of place or belonging, or historical connection to forebears or ancestors. And so the way that we label groups for human beings, and especially in the social sciences, is of deep importance. And I wanted to provide a few examples showing the sort of borderline cases or the areas in where getting group labels correct is actually very important. So the first case is the case of Dr. James Berry, who was identified or has been contemporarily identified as a secret transgender Victorian surgeon, partly because the person named James Berry had previously been born as a different person. And so this is an important attempt to get the label right as to what group or how did Dr. James Berry identify. Importance is also noted with respect to things like classification of past intimate relationships. And so this is taken from a news article that discusses the, quote, hidden gay British histories, close quote, that takes center stage 50 years after decriminalization in the UK. These relationships happened millennia ago, and it's important for how we understand things as human beings to get accurate what happened with respect to past actions or relationships. And it is important with respect to whether or not we can say things about what human beings were doing were comparable to what's happening currently. We also have another example of the person named Joseph Lobdell, who was identified as being one of the US's first transgender men. This is an important way of trying to get clear as to what Joseph Lobdell identified as, partly because their actions may not be able to match the lexicon at the time. And so this is important because we do take self-identification by individuals regarding their particular group identity seriously. We also find this another example of this with the person Albert Cashier, who was identified as one of the first, contemporarily identified as one of the first transgender people to serve in the US military. Again, these descriptions are important for placing individuals in particular types of social contexts. So, additionally, besides group labels, racial labels are also very important for the ways in which individuals and larger people, like larger groups of people, organize themselves in society and understand themselves, not only in their history, their present, and their future. This is a picture of Adriano Aspiat, who is a representative for the US government, who identifies as Afro-Latino, a Dominican of African descent. With respect to rules for political organizing or group membership in US democracy, he's only eligible to be a member of either the Congressional Black Caucus or the Congressional Latino Caucus. As someone who identifies as both, the label that he ends up holding on to will be important for which group he's allowed to be a member of. And this is the same for recently elected Richie Torres, who also identifies as an Afro-Latino person, who, due to particular rules and particular boundary conditions, would only be eligible for applying to be part of either the Congressional Black Caucus or the Congressional Latino Caucus. even though both people have said that they want to be part of both. Racial labels are also important with respect to policy decisions. And so in Brazil, there's the case of Fernando, which is a pseudonym, of someone who identified as being part of a group and then used that group identity to gain access to educational resources, but then was in some senses, quote unquote, found out and then was kicked out of university. The labels that are used for groups are important for doing particular policy interventions that may push back against particular ways of discrimination. And speaking of discrimination, group labels or racial labels are important for getting the actual group correct and not having instances of reference failure. This person who is currently the previous president of the Sergeants Benevolent Association approved a particular video that said that police officers were victims of blue racism, even though within the video itself, it identified purported racial groups in the US. And so in some senses, having a nested racial group within a larger racial group runs contrary to the understanding of how racial labels ought to be applied. And so we have all sorts of ways and reasons for trying to get not only group labels correct, but racial labels correct, not only for policy, but for attempts to redress past discrimination. But again, as I said at the beginning, for ways of understanding an individual's context in history, in the present, and towards the future. So specifically with respect to group descriptions, we want to be able to track groups across time. We do want to be able to provide explanatory support for historical events. We definitely organize parts of a society around groups, whether those are institutions or social groups, smaller units like families, perhaps. The way that we describe these interactions or these collections of individuals does matter. We also want to correctly capture the historical development of groups. We want to be able to say something about boundaries and dynamics. Who's allowed to be part of a group and who isn't, and for what reasons, what criteria. We also want to understand the ways in which we are connected to groups. Can we be parts of groups simultaneously? Is there coextension? Can we be part of one and not the other? These things matter for why individuals want to get group descriptions correct. We also have some negative reasons for why we deal with group descriptions. We do want to avoid incorrect tracking of groups. We don't want to assign a referent to a group that just isn't it. We do want to avoid reference failure, especially in the empirical social sciences, which is the focus of my talk. We do want to avoid incorrect attribution of other historical connections to groups, either superfluous or otherwise. We also wish to avoid harmful essentializations. We wish to avoid stereotyping, and we want to avoid particular types of epistemic injustice, treating particular groups as either knowing less or not knowing enough with respect to particular experiences. And so I use the we as sort of like an epistemic body. Certainly there are people who do not fall within that purview, but nevertheless I'm using it as a shorthand for what is trying to be done, at least in the social sciences. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about some debates on historical description and give you a bit of an overview of what's happening in both in philosophy and in history and historiography. So in framing the debate, largely the discussion about labeling of groups or labeling of past events in history or philosophy or historiography is largely centered around three things. Dealing with historical individuals and their intentions, things like historical events, and broader theoretical concerns that mesh both history and historical and philosophical concerns. So with respect to individuals, we have a number of authors who have tried to write about things regarding the intention of individuals, like Julius Caesar, who intended to not be killed. We've had authors who have discussed ways in which individuals understand concepts and whether or not they are anachronistic or not. We have particular discussions of historical accuracy. including things about realism about historical events or facts about the past, how to be objective in historiography, how to provide explanation in historiography as a corollary to things like explanation in physics or explanation in biology, and other sorts of general philosophical concerns about how to be accurate in history. However, all of these sort of these articles and these book chapters don't necessarily connect directly with the focus of my talk, which is groups themselves. So we do have other historical or philosophical concerns that connect with groups, but largely they're connected to things like group action, group agency, and meaning for groups. So all of these particular articles that I've given a brief overview are, they tangentially connect to the topic at hand, which is retrospective description of racial groups, but they don't quite hit the nail on the head, so to speak. And so we might think that in order to provide some sort of help for getting this problem rectified, perhaps instead of turning to the historical or philosophical literature on historiography, perhaps we can turn to the literature and philosophy of race regarding racial groups. And so perhaps metaphysical accounts of race can help. So there are I give three broad classes of ontological accounts for race. One is biological realism, the second is social constructionism, and the third is anti-realism. For the purposes of this talk, I've excluded or bracketed accounts that are both biologically real and socially constructed, accounts like Kitcher and Robin Andreassen's work, largely because they take on the problems of both of the classes of views that they're drawing from. So biological realists, whether they happen to be morphological groups or populations, have largely tended to try to connect contemporary racial labels, at least in the US, to purported groupings of individuals. For social constructionism, this largely encapsulates ways in which things are brought about through actions or practices of either groups or institutions, nation states perhaps, or any combination of the above, that makes the fact of the matter of whether or not someone is part of a particular race a real thing. Anti-realist accounts largely reject both biological realism and social constructionism, and say that race is neither of the two due to particular faults with the, not just the methodology, but the conceptual apparatus that underlies biological realist and social constructionist accounts. So there are some problems for applying all three of these sort of classes of accounts to the problem at hand. For biological realism, if biological realist accounts tend to use contemporary US racial labels, then this misses the point. Partly because the extension of US racial labels is nowhere near able to account for the variety of ways in which individuals and groups have been described as racial throughout time and across geopolitical contexts. Social constructionist accounts largely talk about institutions and practices, but they tend to have an implicit leaning upon a type of biological realism that undermines their ability to have a social constructionism that is clear and distinct from any sort of importation of the issues of biological racial realism. Anti-realists who take biological realism and social constructionism to be at fault have a problem on their hands if they've argued that both of those classes of accounts don't help out. The problem is what to do with racial language. And so unlike one of the issues found in Joshua Glasgow's work is that Glasgow in the 2008 work, A Theory of Race, argues for racial anti-realism, but then in the book reconstructs race. And so that reconstruction of race ends up moving it from an anti-realist space to a particular type of realism. So there's lots going on here, and it's not clear how we're going to sort of proceed from just one of these accounts. So in this section, I'm going to get a chance to develop a solution and to start sketching out the ways in which we ought to make headway, or we could make headway, with respect to retroactive descriptions of racial groups. So first of all, I want to talk about some of the features that I'd like to have for a solution. First is that I'd like to have a satisfactory semantic account for how racial terms are used. Secondly, a satisfactory account for connecting each category in the account, or each classificatory category in the account, to the actual referent, which is the group itself. The solution ideally will be sensitive to historical change of the referent. And this has happened in a number of other scientific disciplines. And we can talk a little bit about them during the Q&A. But we would like to have the ability to be sensitive to the fact that reference may change depending on our best theoretical framework. And the fourth is that ideally there would be a way to coherently apply labels to past phenomena that doesn't involve an inherent contradiction or an incoherence that undermines the whole theoretical apparatus. So we're going to proceed in developing the solution by taking a couple of cases. And this is largely taken from Ian Hacking's work, that Ian Hacking said that there's no sort of universal or completely generalizable way to understand or describe historical actions. So the methodology that we're going to use for this project is to look at a couple of cases, try to establish some boundary conditions, and then see how the case of race fits within that boundary condition. These may be controversial, but the point of doing it in this particular way now moves the focus onto the methodology and ways of improving it, rather than disputes about the ontological commitments that are presupposing a type of realism or anti-realism. So paradigm case number one is going to be people. And so it seems to be slightly, or as probably as unproblematic as it possibly can, to refer to previous groups of human beings as people. Now, granted, there is some sort of worry that there's a partial biological underpinning of this, but it seems like we can still refer to organisms that are currently not living as people. Again, we can start to sort of hash these things out, but it seems like this is one of the few cases that is on the end of the spectrum that says, yeah, we can pretty much go for this. People seems to be a paradigm case that we can extend it as far back as the human species. The paradigm case number two is hip-hop artists. And so if we take hip-hop as a sort of genre in response to particular genres beforehand, it seems to be the case that we can be infelicitous in assigning groups the label of being a hip-hop or individuals as part of the group hip-hop artists if these individuals existed or were partaking in music or musical expression before roughly 1970. Now, there have been a number of sort of records in the soul and funk category that have talked about the practice of rapping. But with respect to things like self-identifying as a hip-hop artist, it seems prior to 1970 that assignment would be infelicitous. And we can think about this if the case of hip-hop artists is not to your liking. You can think of it with respect to other cases that are based in contemporary understandings of group labels that don't apply to the past. You may think of people who attend Zoom conferences. To apply that to people in, say, 1830, that also seems to be a clear case of being infelicitous. And so we start to think about the case of race. And so race was introduced, or at least was first in print in 1680. And some of the earliest debates regarding the ontology or some of the ontology or metaphysical commitments regarding race were between both Herder and Immanuel Kant, roughly about a century later. And so if we take the evidence that the concept of race was first used in print in 1680, I recommend, according to the particular cases that we used previously, the paradigm cases for boundaries for appropriate or felicitous use of labeling and infelicitous use, and apply this to race, it seems like we get the following. That With respect to the case of race, if it's after 1690, we can label groups as being racial groups. If it's before 1670, we probably cannot. Anything roughly around the decade between 1670 and 1690, maybe with particular caveats. And so before proceeding to the next slide, these are rough estimates. And so I'm not committed to the actual decade as being the sort of threshold. Rather, take these decades largely as fuzzy boundaries, where the justification for using race seems to be even clearer as you go further in time from 1680 to the present. It seems worse as we go from roughly 1670 to the past, and in the sort of range between 1670 and 1690 is the fuzziness where you'd have to make a particular case for why the concept would be aptly labeled for groups at that time. And so I've tried to provide a few guidelines for retrospective description of these particular racial groups. And so things we ought to do when considering labeling these groups are the following. One is that we take the testimony of participants or individuals seriously. That's largely because people are able to largely locate themselves within a social structural framework with respect to things like race. We ought to corroborate testimony with other forms of evidence in order to do things like perhaps triangulate. We can take it with respect to testimony, either verbal with written or other sorts of institutional facts. We should make transparent the methodological considerations for applying racial labels to past groups. We should also be committed to providing evidence rather than proof, because we are making the claim or making a case for why a particular group gets a particular label or not. Partly because we're not in that particular time when we can actually say with any particular certainty that a particular group does deserve a particular type of label. We should also be open to revision of data or our analysis in light of further evidence. So perhaps if we're using one variety of evidence, namely, say, census documents, and we get other types of evidence, namely letters from the person that we are considering as part of being a part of a particular group to other people, or heads of institutional groups to other heads of institutional groups, we should be open to revising whether or not our labels happen to fit. And this process of revision is completely accepted and permissible in a number of different empirical scientific endeavors. There are things that we should avoid with respect to retrospective descriptions. We should avoid projecting labels onto groups naively or dogmatically. This is especially so for particular types of biological realists, namely people like Neil Reich or Esteban Burchard, who largely state that these are the 5 categories of races that are found in the US Census from the 1997 OMB definition are the biological races. We should avoid doing these sorts of dogmatic or sort of naive kind of labeling, because there's more evidence that needs to be brought up to ascertain whether or not those labels fit. We should avoid taking a small sample size as completely generalizable. We should avoid obscuring or burying methodological considerations. We should avoid having physics envy. And so this should be, I want to take a point just to be very clear about this, that number one, I'm not knocking physics, because I like physics. Physics is great. But this is important for understanding particular aspects of doing the empirical social sciences. It should be the case that if we're understanding retrospective description, we do take quantitative aspects seriously. We should also take seriously the qualitative aspects as well, partly because the understanding of concepts like racial labels or gender labels largely can be teased out from a qualitative standpoint. So it doesn't mean that it's technically physics envy. It's an envy of a particular conceptualization of physics, which is highly quantified. We should not do that in the social sciences. We should also not ignore or avoid ignoring other sources of data. We shouldn't be sort of held fast and fixed onto one particular type of evidence as the evidence to rule them all. So here are some further implications for my sort of sketch of a solution to applying racial labels retrospectively. My solution has the following benefits. Ideally, it fits neatly with social scientific practice in the ways that we take evidence from participants, we take self-identification to be serious, we take the way in which people's actions and how they describe them seriously. My solution makes no deeply incompatible ontological commitments. It's largely an instrumentalist account that tries to make sense of how labels can be applied to groups without making any claims about what is the nature of those groups themselves. My solution account allows for a shift from ontological concerns to methodological and empirical concerns. There's been largely discussions, at least in philosophy of race, regarding the ontological or the metaphysical standpoint. And this particular account, if successful, now starts to shift the what's going on in philosophy of race to how do we understand past groups, what are the correct labels for doing so, and the ramifications for other particular disciplines like sociology, demography, epidemiology, political science, and even history. And the last implication is that it's able to accommodate future racial groups. And so this is a thing that is largely absent from other sort of metaphysical accounts for philosophy of race. Largely those accounts, whether they're both biological realist or social constructionist, try to understand race at the contemporary level and then potentially project backwards. But both of those classes of accounts do not, by and large, are able to accommodate future racial groups. And whether that happens to be referentialist accounts for referentialist social construction accounts or biological realist accounts like Spencer's, which states that the US 5 racial categories are the biological populations. Let me try to tease this out a little bit. In the US, there has been a move for individuals to be recognized as being part of the SWANA region rather than the MENA region, where MENA stands for Middle Eastern North African and SWANA stands for Southwest Asian and North African. My account allows for this particular type of flexibility for groups to change, and it allows for there to be continuity between persons who at one point fell under the group label MENA and who now may fall under the group level of the group name SWANA. Other accounts that are social constructionists or biological realists largely will be unable to be initially accommodate new or developing racial groups. So I want to take some time to go over a few objections and replies, because as all good philosophy talks do, there are probably ways in which I've gotten some things wrong or things that I might not have considered. So objection number one might be the following. Does my account deny the deep connections someone may have to past groups? Well, the answer is no. And that's largely because the ways in which individuals create meaning is largely a factor, largely causally related to a number of different factors. My account is largely focused on the ways that we understand labeling of past purported racial groups in the empirical social sciences. There are lots and lots of discussions on the ways in which meaning connects to an individual's sense of self or place of belonging. And it's not to deny it, but rather to treat just the labeling as the focus of my talk. Objection number two. Does my account imply that this solution will work for other social scientific terms like gender or class? And the very long story short is no, largely because I don't take it that my account is that easily generalizable to all sorts of social scientific terms or concepts. I think that there's important work to be done in order to show that, but I take that as being, that's part of the philosophical project for making the case for something, rather than doing a sort of like a top-down, it works for one particular concept, we can now make the generalization across a number of concepts. I think having a more piecemeal approach to developing a case for this is the way to go. So it's in some sense a meta-philosophical methodological commitment that I'm making, which is to, if we want to see if it works for other social scientific terms or categories, we need to make the case for doing so. I provided a methodology for doing so. It may or may not work out, and that is okay. And number three, does my account imply that this solution will work for other descriptive phenomena in the past? This is a still from the book by Lynn Farley, who is widely credited for coining the term sexual harassment in the mid to late 1970s. And so does my account imply that it will work for other descriptive phenomena like that of actions? And I also think that no, it doesn't necessarily work for other descriptive phenomena of historical actions. And that's largely because I haven't made the case for that. I'm largely trying to make a very restricted case on whether or not group labels that are racial are applicable or non-applicable to groups in the past. There's been lots and lots of work that has been done by both historians, sociologists, activists, and philosophers regarding how we should understand things like historical actions, whether they're from the point of individuals or groups themselves. So in conclusion, I want to line up the following things. So I've got four main takeaways for my account. The first is that my instrumental account makes sense of the limits and accuracy of racial retrospective description, but it remains restricted to racial retrospective description and not other social categories. The second is that there are methodological and epistemological considerations for applying racial labels to historical groups. Those include things like taking different types of evidence seriously, trying to corroborate them, and trying to make them into a particular coherent whole. My account is strictly limited to frameworks within the social sciences writ large. And again, this doesn't have an effect on considerations of individuals' understandings of meaning or identity in a rich way that only the empirical science or the social sciences can only get a sliver of. And the last one is that we should proceed with caution before attempting to generalize to other terms used in the social sciences. This goes for things like gender or class or sexuality, which have lots of causal inputs and outputs, and have a different dynamic or purported dynamic for connecting individuals to particular group labels.